Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the United States Department of Justice and to today's summit on combating anti-Semitism. My name is John Gore, and I currently serve as the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division here at the Department of Justice. I will be your MC today as we hear from government officials, policymakers, community leaders, advocates, and scholars, all of whom are committed to eradicating the un-American and hateful scourge of anti-Semitism from our communities and our country. I am pleased to be joined on the stage today by the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, and by the Deputy Attorney General, Jeff Rosen. We will hear from both of them momentarily. Before we get to their remarks, please stand as you are able to honor our country and our flag during the presentation of the colors by the U.S. Navy Ceremonial Guard and the singing of the national anthem by Master Sergeant Kevin Benier of the President's own U.S. Marine Band.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Color Guard, please retire the colors. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for our invocation, which will be offered by Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveitchik of Congregation Shearith Israel.
וישבו איש תחת גפנו ותחת תאנתו ואין מחריד, כפי אדוני צבאות דיבר. And they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the Lord of hosts has spoken. Please join me in prayer. Ribono shel olam, eternal God, over 2 centuries ago, the Jews of Newport express thankfulness to you, God, for America. They wrote to George Washington these words: "Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, behold a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance." In response, Washington cited the words of the prophet Micah. Washington wrote, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." Today, we too thank you, God, for America, whose founders were inspired by the Bible to create a country unlike any other, one which rejected anti-Semitism and served thereby as a beacon of liberty to the world. Avinu Av Harachaman, our most merciful Father, bless the Attorney General of the United States and the conference that he has convened today. Help us to work for a world which gives bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance, and allow us all to see the fulfillment of the prayer with which Washington concluded his letter to Newport's Jews. Washington wrote, "May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy. Amen."
Please be seated. Thank you, Rabbi Soloveitchik, for invoking God's blessings upon us, and a reminder of the inextricable link between the Jewish community and the American founding. Thank you to the U.S. Navy Ceremonial Guard for that stirring presentation of the colors, and to Master Sergeant Bonnier for that majestic rendition of the national anthem. I'm now honored to introduce the 38th Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Rosen. Deputy Attorney General Rosen was sworn into the department on May 22, 2019, after a distinguished career in the public and private sectors. He's previously served in the Department of Transportation as a Deputy Secretary and earlier as a General Counsel, as well as the General Counsel of the Office of Management and Budget. He is a staunch advocate of religious liberty, of a country free of discrimination of all Americans, and we are honored and privileged to have his leadership here at the Department of Justice. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Attorney General Rosen.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us at this important summit. I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to set the table and introduce the Attorney General, Bill Barr. I suspect most of us here today are aware that Attorney General Barr has had a distinguished career in private practice and in government, including time as the head of the Office of Legal Counsel and as Deputy Attorney General, and that he served as the General Counsel of a major corporation. I am confident that nearly everyone knows that he served previously as the 77th Attorney General of the United States, and now again as the 85th Attorney General of the United States. But what many may not know is that when Bill Barr was previously Attorney General, he was, in May 1992, honored by Agudath Israel of America with its Humanitarian of the Year Award. So his commitment to using the power of the federal government to ensure the free practice of religion and to fight those who traffic in vile anti-Semitic acts is not new. Indeed, in his confirmation hearings nearly 3 decades ago, he emphasized that invidious discrimination, quote, strikes at the very nature and fiber of what this country stands for, close quote. And then, as Attorney General, he pledged, quote, the Department of Justice's unyielding commitment to eliminating anti-Semitism and other forms of religious bigotry, close quote. Then, Good to his word, as Attorney General the first time, he aggressively pursued anti-Semitic hate crimes. Under his leadership, the Department of Justice successfully convicted 8 members of hate groups for desecrating a synagogue in Nashville, Tennessee, 5 individuals for conspiracy to interfere with the rights of a Holocaust survivor in San Diego who had been subjected to a vicious campaign of anti-Semitic harassment, numerous skinheads around the country for a variety of anti-Semitic crimes, and convicted neo-Nazis who had been responsible for the murder of a prominent radio host, Alan Berg, in Denver, Colorado. As Attorney General, he also fought against anti-Semitic zoning discrimination in Airmont, New York. Now, unfortunately, fighting anti-Semitism, perhaps the world's oldest hatred, requires unyielding vigilance. According to the FBI, hate crimes based on religion have steadily grown in the United States since 2014, and anti-Jewish hate crimes have consistently been more than half of the totals each year. More recently, horrific murders at Jewish synagogues in Pittsburgh and San Diego have alerted us again that this is not just a problem in Europe, South America, and the Mideast. We must confront those responsible for hateful acts wherever and whenever they are found, whether in our cities, on our college campuses, in our workplaces, online, and particularly as to those who would intimidate, terrorize, or cause harm to others. Now, I have known Attorney General Barr for a long time, so I knew of his strong views about both the protection of religious freedom and about fighting against intolerance and crimes against religious communities. And as he told the Senate at his most recent confirmation, if I can quote him once more, he said, "We can only survive and thrive as a nation if we are mutually tolerant of each other's differences. Each of us treasures our own freedom, but that freedom is most secure when we respect everyone else's freedom. And yet we see some people violently attacking others simply because of their differences. We must have zero tolerance for such crimes." End of quote. Those words guide us both today and going forward as the Department of Justice punishes hate crimes and as we protect religious liberty. So, with this short introduction of his long record of combating anti-Semitism, it is my great privilege to welcome Attorney General Bill Barr.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction, and I'd like to offer a special thanks to Rabbi Soloveitchik for his benediction. I also want to thank everyone who helped to bring this summit together, in particular Larry Rothenberg, Lindsay Friedman, and Katie Kreitzer from the Office of Legal Policy, Omed Asefi from the Civil Rights Division, and Brian Pandya and Patrick Davis from the Office of the Associate Attorney General. And finally, let me say thank you to Secretary Steve Mnuchin, Secretary Betsy DeVos, and Special Envoy Elan Carr, and FBI Director Chris Wray, who are joining us here today for this summit. Today's program includes a great set of panelists and speakers. For one thing, you will be hearing throughout the day from federal officials across the administration about our efforts to combat anti-Semitism. I know that for me and for the Department of Justice, this is a critical priority. I'm deeply concerned about the rise in hate crimes and political violence that we have seen over the past decade. And this trend has included a marked increase in reported instances of anti-Semitic hate crimes. The most ancient and stubborn form of racism throughout Western history has been anti-Semitism. The causes have been varied. At times, it has been driven by religious intolerance, cultural differences, economic envy, and ideological dogma. Sometimes those disappointed with their own lot in life seize on conspiracy theories to blame the Jewish people for their own discontent. And sometimes political factions competing for power find in the Jewish people a convenient scapegoat to unify and inflame their political base. Hostility or prejudice against the Jewish people has manifested itself in the organized violence of pogroms, expulsions, and massacres. Within living memory, these genocidal acts reached the unimaginable scale and evil of the Holocaust. In the United States today, we do not see state-organized violence, but increasingly we are seeing hate-inspired violence against the Jewish community perpetrated by individuals and groups. This past year in particular, the entire nation saw the evil fruits of this anti-Semitism in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue and in California at the Shabbat at Poway. In both instances, gunmen motivated by hatred against Jews opened fire, killing worshipers and injuring others. We were all horrified by these attacks. Federal, state, and local law enforcement responded quickly and decisively. Of course, it is one thing for the nation to pull together in condemning anti-Semitism when confronted with front-page stories about horrific shootings, as in Pittsburgh and Poway. But far too often, Jews and Jewish communities in America suffer outside the spotlight. In New York City this past year, we have seen a sharp uptick in attacks on Orthodox Jews, particularly in the Crown Heights neighborhood. People are attacking Jews in the streets and vandalizing synagogues. In Massachusetts, in March, vandals desecrated 59 gravestones in a Jewish cemetery, knocking over headstones and scrolling swastikas and hateful graffiti. While the tragic attacks in Pittsburgh and Poway appropriately drew national attention, these attacks and others like them in communities across the country sadly are less well known outside the Jewish community. But they form the daily background of concerns about security and safety that many in the Jewish community feel. The nation as a whole must be aware of these concerns and reject the forces that motivate them. As Attorney General and a fellow citizen, I want to assure the Jewish community that the Department of Justice and the entire federal government stands with you and will not tolerate these attacks. Anti-Semitism in the United States manifests itself in many ways other than outright violence. Prejudice is often reflected in zoning laws designed to exclude Jews from residing in particular communities. It is also manifest in the harassment of Jewish individuals and businesses. That is also why today is about far more than criminal prosecutions. We need to combat anti-Semitism on all fronts as a government, but also as a society. We are therefore grateful that today's summit will include thoughtful discussions with several outside contributors who have been gracious to join us. The first panel will focus on combating anti-Semitism while respecting the First Amendment. Hate crimes and civil rights prosecutions are important tools, but they cannot solve the problem on their own. Hearts and minds must be changed, but that is not always the task to which the government is particularly well suited. We have a legal obligation to respect the free speech rights of even despicable speakers and our harshest critics. But lines can be drawn by our society, sometimes easily and sometimes not so easily, between that commitment and repudiation of anti-Semitism. Another panel will focus on the problem of anti-Semitism on campus. On college campuses today, Jewish students who support Israel are frequently targeted for harassment. Jewish student organizations are marginalized, and progressive Jewish students are told that they must denounce their beliefs and their heritage in order to be part of intersectional causes. We must ensure, for the future of our country and our society, that college campuses remain open to ideological diversity and respect for people of all faiths. I think that the various forms of anti-Semitism is very much like different kinds of cancer. A healthy body with a strong immune system can have success in preventing cancer from emerging or spreading. But if the immune system weakens, cancer can emerge. Some might be localized, but others can rapidly metastasize and become systemic. Just like a physical body, a body politic must have an immune system that resists anti-Semitism and other forms of racial hatred. What is the state of our immune system within American society? In a pluralistic society like ours, I think the ability to resist hate comes from cultivating a civil society that, on the one hand, nurtures the freedom of each group to pursue their faith and distinctive way of life, while at the same time fostering the ties that bind us together into a genuine, broader community. My concern today is that under the banner of identity politics, some political factions are seeking to obtain power by dividing Americans, and they undermine the values that draw us together, such as a shared commitment to our country's success. This is the breeding ground for hatred, and we must reject it. What is the competing vision? I'm reminded of something that happened 2 months after 9/11 up in New York. An American airline flight with 260 souls aboard took off from JFK, went wildly out of control over Jamaica Bay, and crashed into the small Bell Harbor neighborhood of Rockaway in Queens. The community had just completed burying its victims of 9/11, 50 of them, the highest concentration of victims of any neighborhood in New York from 9/11. All on board the flight died, as did 5 people on the ground, and many houses were consumed by fire. Now, a news report on the incident has always stuck in my mind. It involved a man-on-the-street interview of a lifelong resident of Bell Harbor. With fires raging behind him, he was distraught but unbowed as he assured the reporter that Bell Harbor would surmount this latest tragedy. He said, "This is a tight-knit community. We have fabric. You have your Irish, you have your Italians, you have your Jews. So we're pretty homogeneous." That's always stuck with me. We're pretty homogeneous. Is there a better description of the framers' aspiration of a pluribus unum? We are a pluralistic nation composed of very distinct groups, each bound together by ethnicity, race, or religion, each group proud of its identity and committed to its faith and traditions. Yet despite these differences, we can be bound together into a broader community, not one that seeks to grind away our distinctive identity, not one that seeks to overbear our religious commitments, which must be paramount, but one that respects, indeed delights in the freedom of each of us to hold fast our identity, our values, our religion, the part of us that give meaning to our lives, that help us understand our place and our purpose in this creation. So where does this fabric come from? What is it? It's not something that can be politically mandated. It arises from the genuine affinity, affection, and solidarity that grows out of a shared patriotism and that spontaneous feeling of fellowship that arises from a shared sense of place, shared experiences, and common attachments. These bonds are the surest safeguard against racial hatred, including anti-Semitism. So with that, I would like to thank all of you again for being here. I was going to conclude with the blessing contained in President Washington's letter to the Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, but the good rabbi has preempted me on that. So I will just say again, thank you, and God bless you all, and God bless our work today.
Thank you, Attorney General Barr, Deputy Attorney General Rosen, for those outstanding remarks, for your leadership on this issue, and your commitment to an equal America for all of our countrymen. Ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to stand and stretch for a moment while we rearrange the stage for our first panel discussion, which will begin promptly in 5 minutes. Our first panel discussion this morning is entitled Combating Anti-Semitism While Respecting the First Amendment. Our moderator is Eli Lake. Mr. Lake is a distinguished and widely respected Bloomberg columnist covering national security and foreign policy. He is a former senior correspondent for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, The New York Sun, and The Washington Times. We are thrilled to have his unique perspective to guide today's discussion. Eli, the panel is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Is this on? Check. Okay. Thank you very much. And we have a terrific panel to discuss all of this. So let me start to my far right here with Elliot Zweig. He is the Deputy Director of the Middle East Media Research Institute. Since 2002, he's served as MEMRI's in many capacities, including leading the MEMRI government and media relations effort as MEMRI's Director of Government and Public Affairs. And Mr. Zweig routinely briefs major media outlets about MEMRI research and about trends in the Arab and Muslim world, including CNN, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, CBS, NBC, NPR, BBC, and CBC, Voice of America, and numerous other leading American and international media outlets. Here we have Christopher Hardy. He is the Chief Counsel of Policy for the National Security Division of the Department of Justice. Chris serves as the Chief of the Office of Law and Policy at the National Security Division, which provides the legal and policy advice on national security issues that confront the Department of Justice, and they include terrorist use of the internet. Previously, Chris served as Senior Counsel to the Deputy Attorney General and Counsel to the Associate Attorney General. To my left here is Jason Isaacson. He is the Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer of the American Jewish Committee. Jason's a longtime analyst of U.S. political and strategic affairs and oversees AJC's political international operations. In 2015, he coordinated in Brussels the Defining Moment for Europe conference on strategies to combat resurgent anti-Semitism. In 2007, the French Minister of Culture and Communications awarded him the rank of Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters, and in July 2009, King Mohammed VI of Morocco bestowed on Isaacson the honor of Chevalier of the Order of the Throne of the Kingdom of Morocco. Finally, we have Professor Eugene Kontorovich, who teaches at George Mason University, Antonin Scalia School of Law, and is the director of its new Center for International Law and the Middle East. He previously taught at Northwestern and the University of Chicago and is also a scholar at the Kohelet Policy Forum, which is a Jerusalem think tank. Jerusalem Post has called him the intellectual architect of state anti-BDS laws. And now we'll hear a brief presentation from our panelists. Let's start with you, Elliot.
هناك من يصطاد للفضائيات الناطقة باللغة العربية. هناك مؤسسة اسمها ميموري ترصدكم، ترصد الجزيرة، ترصد الحوار، ترصد كل القنوات، ترصد القدس، وتبحث عن ثغرات ومداخل لإيقافكم عن البث. ذلك مصطلح اليهود لابد أن التعامل معه بحذر.
أن الله سلط عليهم طوال التاريخ من يؤدبهم نتيجة إفسادهم. آخر تأديب كان تأديب هتلر، والمرة القادمة إن شاء الله ستكون على أيدي المؤمنين.
نحن طبعا هتلر ده احنا المفروض نقيم له تمثال على ما فعله باليهود يعني.
مين الزعيم التاريخي اللي هيك بتلفتك مسيرته؟
يعني بستحي.
بتستحي؟
بخاف لا ما بخاف يا خيي. هتلر ايه.
الله يوفق.
هي عقدة الاضطهاد هي عقدة يهودية دائما، يعني على مستوى تاريخهم أو تواجدهم في الجامعات داخل أوروبا.
بس هل هم كانوا مضطهدون بالفعل؟
لا، هم لم يكن. هم حتى أن أفران الغاز كما يزعم اليهود لا تتحمل الملايين التي أخبر عنها. يعني الموضوع ضخم إعلاميا، ضخم علميا، حتى أن علماء التاريخ لا يستطيع الاقتراب من فكرة الهولوكوست. لا يمكن. إنها جريمة اسمها معاداة السامية.
معاداة السامية، نعم.
بشوف أوروبا عم تعتذر للصهيونية عن وهم اسمه الهولوكوست، جعلوا ألمانيا على الحديدة، فهتلر عاملهم كخونة وحاكمهم كخونة. وحكاية 6 مليون كذبة قد الوجود، أقصى حد 600,000 زادوا صفر بس.
هذه كارثة. لذلك فرانكلين أو بنيامين فرانكلين رئيس أمريكي سابق عام 1789 أصدر بيان خطير، ثم قال هذا الخطر هو اليهود، ففي كل بلد يستقرون فيه يحطمون الروح المعنوية. هتلر في كتابه كفاحي حذر قومه، حذر الألمان ودعاهم إلى محاربة الدعارة التي ينشرها اليهود. وكل ذلك إخواني الكرام كما يقول اليهود أنها ديانة، هذا في توراتهم.
كره اليهود من القرآن. علمنا القرآن في كثير من الآيات، كثير من الآيات، أكثر من 40 أو 50 آية في القرآن الكريم في التحذير من اليهود وشرهم وخبثهم وأنهم أعداء الله عز وجل.
دي أجسام بني آدمين ميتة وعظام يهود متدمرة، وده فرن كان اليهود بيتشووا جواه، وادي يهودي بيحضروهم للحرق. شوفوا ادي يهود، شوفوا الذل على وجهه ازاي، اجسام عماله سبحان الله العظيم. هم ظلمه.
نحن كنا نسكنوا في بلاس ونحن صغار. في البلاس نسكنوا فيه يافي 3 فامي جويف يسكنوا معنا. صدقني ملي صغير الريحه نتاع لي جويف ما نحملهاش. ريحتهم هما ايزون اون اودور سبيسيال. راهو
أنا شخصياً وأنا مسؤولة عن كلامي، أنا يعني رؤيتي أنا الشخصية مربوطة دايماً وعلى طول وللنهاية بشيء قريناه ببيت أهلي لما كنا صغار. البابا الله يرحمه جاب على البيت اسمه بروتوكولات زعماء صهيون. قالنا اقروا هيدا الكتاب وهيدا لا تموتوا ما بتنسوا شو انتوا قريتوا فيه. أنا بوقتها قريت عن أنه الصهيونية العالمية عندها خطة لتفتيت العالم العربي كله.
قبل ذلك فسرنا هذا العدوان هو تحريش بين النصارى والمسلمين. إذن المنتفع هم اليهود.
من أشهر العقائد عند اليهود أنهم في عيد معين عندهم يذبحون طفل مسيحي، يأخذون دمه ويسوون منه كيكة تؤكل في يوم هذا اليوم. هتلر لاحظ أن لا يوجد حركة سرية تحارب النظام الاجتماعي إلا وراها اليهود. لاحظ أن أفلام الجنس والقصص المكشوفة أو الأدب المكشوف اللي وراه اليهود، فقال إذا أرادت فعلا ألمانيا تتقدم أنها تخلص من اليهود أو من سيطرتهم.
وكالة ميموري للترجمة، الترجمة دقيقة وصحيحة. ما بعرف أحيانا من أين مصادر معلوماتهم. لو إمام مسجد صغير في قرية في الربع الخالي قال شيئا ضد اليهود تجدهم ترجموه وحطوه على طاولات 435 عضو في الكونغرس و100 شيخ أعضاء في مجلس الشيوخ.
اللهم
اللهم عليك باليهود الملاعين واقتلهم بددا يا رب لا تبق منهم أحدا اللهم يتم أطفالهم اللهم رمل نساءهم
اللهم عليك باليهود الصهاينة فإنهم لا يعجزونك أحصهم عددا واقتلهم بددا ولا تغادر منهم أحدا
فيختبئ اليهودي وراء الشجر والحجر فيقول الشجر والحجر يا مسلم يا عبد الله هذا يهودي خلفي تعال فاقتله إلا الغرقد فإنه من شجر اليهود
قاتلون اليهود أنتم شرقي النهر وهم غربيه حتى يقول الحجر والشجر يا مؤمن يا عبد الله هذا يهودي خلفي فتعال فاقتل قدام المسجد الأقصى تحت أقدام القردة والخنازير هذه الأمة دليلة احصهم جميعا عددا واقتلهم بددا لا تبقي على الأرض منهم أحدا.
You make a statement, you make a comment about this, about that, about the Christians, about the Jews, what do? Huh? They get a problem. Oh, we have to edit the video, Sheikh. Huh? We have to make the video private, yeah, Sheikh, because you mentioned that the Jews are maghdubi alayhim.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect al-Masjid al-Aqsa from the harm of al-Yahud. Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ahlikhum badada wa ahsihim adada wa la tughadir minhum ahada.
سنذود بالأجساد عن أرض الهدى ونقدم الأرواح دون تواني وسنضرب الآناق عن أجسادهم ونحرر الأقصى الحزين العاري.
And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam gave us the glad tidings that at the end of the time we will fight those Jews until the rocks and the trees will speak. O Muslim, this is a Jew behind me.
They make mockery of their deen. Some of them were turned into monkeys and pigs, literally.
لا نتكلم بخطاب إعلامي يحد ويضعفنا ومواقع من ضمنها ميموري هذا الموقع اللي هو يعني يراقب كل شيء وطبعا انظروا إلى معاداة السامية انظروا إلى من يريدون يقتلون اليهود.
Thank you and good morning. You've just seen some of the work of my organization, the Middle East Media Research Institute. You saw men and women, young and old, secular and religious, on state media, independent media, and social media from all across the Middle East, Europe, and America. Memory was established 21 years ago to bridge the language gap between the Middle East and the West by monitoring, translating, and analyzing the media of the Arab and Muslim world, its school books, and the religious content produced by its institutions, scholars, and clergy. It's an honor to be in this hall, a hall which some of our board of director members know very well, including former Attorney General Michael Mnuchin and former FBI Executive Assistant Director Oliver Buck-Revel. One of the most troubling issues we have studied through our 2 decades, alongside that of jihadi indoctrination and incitement, is the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, which is pervasive and deeply rooted in all 3 of those spheres: media, schools, and religious institutions. At the same time, memory translates and amplifies the voices of reformists and liberals in the Arab and Muslim world who fight back within their societies against this hatred. We worked closely with the late Congressman Tom Lantos, the only Holocaust survivor to serve in the House of Representatives and who chaired its Foreign Affairs Committee. Based on Memory's research and archives, which is the largest in the world exposing such content, Congressman Lantos brought forward the Global Anti-Semitism Review Act of 2004, which created the position of Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. After his passing, our archives were renamed in memory of Tom Lantos. In recent years, we've begun a project to translate extremist sermons from American mosques, only a tiny sampling of which you saw in the video. And in April of this year, following attacks in synagogues by white supremacists, we began monitoring anti-Semitic incitement from that sphere as well. Our work there focuses on 3 levels: ideological, mapping out organizational connections and relationships, and providing actionable information that can and already has led to the thwarting of attacks. Memory has been identifying and exposing anti-Semitism for over 2 decades in the Arab and Muslim world, and now in the West and the US as well. It is painful for all Memory staffers involved in these efforts to see the shocking content we come across every day. Some of us, myself included, are children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors whose families were nearly wiped out. Others, like our executive director, have a different direct connection. He grew up in Pittsburgh attending the Tree of Life Synagogue and knew some of those slaughtered there. So we thank you for coming to and for convening this summit and for calling upon us to help to display the scope of the problem. We hope that you'll visit and use www.memory.org as a resource for more of this type of the content needed to expose and fight this hatred, and we stand ready to assist in all efforts to do so. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Chris Hardy. I'm with the National Security Division here at the Department of Justice. The National Security Division oversees, among other things, the department's prosecution of crimes relating to terrorism. We work closely with the FBI in terrorism investigations and with the intelligence community. These include crimes involving international terrorism, such as committed by groups such as ISIS, and also domestic terrorism. Terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are hate groups, right? They all advocate anti-Semitic violence. We're committed to using our counterterrorism tools and our expertise to counter terrorist violence that is inspired by hate. We work closely with the criminal division where crimes involving hate also involve terrorism, including domestic terrorism. So the topic of this panel is how to combat anti-Semitism consistent with the First Amendment. Our experience with respect to the First Amendment issues is on the terrorism side, so I'd like to offer our perspective on the legal and policy frameworks that we've developed to counter terrorism. We have powerful authorities on the terrorism side with respect to international terrorism, so adhering to First Amendment limitations is an important part, and ensuring that the IC does is an important part of the National Security Division's mission, because NSD, we not only help prosecute cases involving terrorism and other threats to national security, but we perform an important oversight role with respect to the FBI's activities and also the intelligence community's activities under surveillance laws and surveillance statutes. So I'll explain our approach in connection with investigations and prosecutions involving terrorist conduct, and also explain a little bit about how we've looked at approaching terrorist use of the internet specifically, and hopefully those frameworks will inform this discussion. So a core principle guiding the department, and including the FBI and also the intelligence community under guidelines that apply to FBI's intelligence activities and also its domestic law enforcement activities, is you cannot open an investigation or monitor conduct based solely on protected speech, the speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. But we can investigate, and this is important, we can investigate individuals where their conduct, which may include speech online, demonstrates a threat of violence, other criminal conduct, or a threat to national security. It is our policy, especially since 9/11, to be proactive in identifying terrorist threats before they cause harm, particularly so for threats that would involve violence against groups within the United States. So we need to balance those two things. We need to be proactive in identifying threats and also respect the First Amendment. We can't just monitor conduct, including conduct online, unless we have a reason to do so in a particular case. So although one's beliefs, no matter how abhorrent, are protected by the First Amendment, we can take action where an individual engages in conduct that constitutes an imminent threat of violence or incitement to violence or solicitation of a crime. And we have examples of cases where we've pursued those types of cases over the years, including the Revolution Muslim case back in 2012 and others. With respect to social media, this has been a significant focus of not just the Department of Justice, but the government overall after the rise of ISIS, and there was a lot of attention paid to it in 2015. We're seeing some of the same types of policy and legal issues come up in the foreign interference context with respect to Russian interference online and those types of issues. So it's not a problem that's just a terrorism problem. We're seeing, as groups use social media and the internet to foster violence and to build their networks and their groups, and the communications networks that they're using are largely domestically based or reach a domestic audience. It raises important First Amendment and legal policy issues about the scope of our investigative authorities and the proper role the intelligence community. So this is something we're seeing across the board. So our terrorism investigations, they often involve the use of social media along with, together with encrypted messaging apps. Often the model that ISIS perfected back in 2015 and on was broadcasting messages, exhorting members to violence using publicly available social media, and then encouraging potential operatives to go offline through encrypted messaging channels. And we're seeing that playbook, you will see it replicated by other types of groups, including domestic groups. So in addition to investigating potential crimes consistent with the First Amendment, as I just discussed, we've worked with, given the limitations on our authorities and the proper role of the government, we worked with the tech sector to help the government and help the public combat the problem of terrorism. So social media companies, they are not limited by the First Amendment and the way the government is limited. Their terms of use are going to prohibit a far broader range of conduct than could be prescribed under criminal laws. So the approach that we've developed with respect to terrorist use of the internet is to develop close working relationships with the major providers. And that is something that model is one that we would likely follow with respect to foreign interference using social media and other types of problems that raise the similar types of issues that we confronted in the terrorism context. So the government, where we have information from a predicated investigation, we're not just monitoring the internet, we can share that threat information with providers. We can provide and do provide threat briefings to providers, and it helps the providers voluntarily use their own efforts to enforce their own terms of service, to improve their own algorithms, improve their own processes for identifying content that is threatening. So that is something that we have been doing since 2015. It is something that we will be doing in connection with foreign interference as well, as I just discussed. And that model has been, we think, effective. We've seen providers taking down, we don't make, generally do not make requests for providers to take down specific posts or specific content, but we will provide threat briefings, we'll provide information to the providers so they can more effectively monitor their own systems consistent with their own terms of service. But we've seen success from encouraging providers to be responsible with respect to monitoring their platforms. Twitter has, I think last year, took down something like 165,000 accounts associated with terrorism. Facebook, I think the report was last year, they removed something like 14 million pieces of terrorist content, largely related to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And now we've seen Facebook enforcing policies with respect to white extremist nationalist groups, violent groups. So that's the framework with which we've approached terrorist use of the internet. But it points to, whether it's terrorist use of the internet using domestic, largely domestic platforms like Facebook or Twitter, or foreign interference, the same thing. The policy issue that we confront is historically, our authorities on the intelligence side they're constrained because they generally look outside the United States and at particular designated groups, right? And so you can share information, but you're not doing it based on monitoring the internet in the United States. You're seeing, if you have surveillance on a group outside the United States, you're seeing connections to that group and their activities that might identify individuals in the United States that then could lead to a predicated investigation. That might lead to information that you could then share. But the issues are very different when you're talking about purely domestic groups and domestic conduct in terms of the authorities that we can bring to bear, and they raise different policy issues about what the proper role of the government is. So it's very important, in light of some of those limitations, for the government to have strong partnerships with civil society, private sector. It's very important to the work that Memory is doing, and we can be partners, and there's nothing, we can speak as the government to providers, we can message to providers as we do in the terrorism context, so long as we're not being threatening or coercive or demanding that they take action, and that is a proper role for the government. We have been doing that in the terrorism context, And that can inform the approach domestically, but there are, I think, more significant First Amendment issues and limitations on the government's conduct when you're talking about domestic speech than international terrorism. So that's the framework that we've been following in those areas.
Thank you and good morning. It's a privilege to be here. Before I begin, though, I wish to acknowledge the considerable work on this issue of my colleague Dan Elbaum, AJC's Chief Advocacy Officer, who was prevented by flight delays from being with us and being on this panel this morning. Just 2 hours or so from now, government officials and civil society leaders from around the world will participate in a candle-lighting ceremony at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and will tour the museum with survivors of religious persecution in what is the opening program of this week's second Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, a major State Department initiative. As we begin today's very welcome Department of Justice Symposium on combating resurgent anti-Semitism, the centrality of the Holocaust, that ultimate expression of eliminationist anti-Semitism, continues to haunt many of us, continues to be invoked, continues to remind us of the dangers of hate and of inaction in the face of hate. Sadly, experience has taught Jews to often cautiously ask ourselves the question of whether history is repeating itself. Is 2019 just a return 80 years on of 1939? The answer is no. There are a host of reasons why today's challenges, though real, are materially different from the historic and unique tragedy faced by European Jewry during history's darkest hour. One obvious difference is the existence of Israel, but perhaps an equally important reason is the people in this room. Many lectures have been given and much ink has been spilled on the forces that unleashed and allowed the Holocaust, but in the end, there are some simple reasons. In a way, it happened simply because no one cared enough to stop it. Not England, not France, not the United States of America. The MS St. Louis was not given refuge, Czechoslovakia was not defended, the tracks to Auschwitz were not bombed, and the early Nazi laws were received with only the feeblest of international protest. It is perhaps not fair to say that the world did not care at all, but somehow there was always something more important to prioritize. Yet today, here we sit in the Department of Justice, in a room dedicated to the son of America's ambassador to London at the start of the Second World War, to devote a full day of the business of law enforcement apparatus of the most important and powerful nation in the world to seeking ways to fight anti-Semitism. We will be addressed by some of the top officials in the administration. This alone is truly something worthy of reflection and celebration. No, it is clearly not 1939, but it is the year 2000. Is it the year 2000 when an ugly and violent wave of anti-Semitism struck France and government officials refused to acknowledge the issue and instead labeled it hooliganism or, quote, the regrettable importation of the Arab-Israeli conflict to France? Is it 2015 when the UK Labour Party, which for generations had been the traditional political home of British Jews, morphed into a political party so rife with institutional anti-Semitism that a majority of England's Jews say they would consider fleeing the country were that party to take power? Is 2019, where in Germany, a nation that has done everything right to make amends for the Holocaust, a senior government official said publicly that Jews should refrain from wearing identifiably Jewish items because it could endanger their safety? And here at home, after the events of the last year, from Pittsburgh to Poway to rhetoric from some elected officials, no, it is not 1939, but it's 2019, and that is cause enough for concern. The stakes for what we do now as a nation are enormous. Consider the current state of European Jewry, where 1 in 3 say they have been harassed at least once in the past year, and 80% say they don't report incidents to the police because they feel that nothing will change. Consider that 1/3 of European Jews won't wear items identifying themselves as Jewish out of fear for their safety. Of course, America has always been different, and our Jewish community feels differently from our brothers and sisters in Europe. The topic my fellow panelists and I have been asked to address is how to combat anti-Semitism, a malevolent force that runs counter to our nation's values, while protecting the right to free speech, perhaps our most cherished American freedom. I'd like to touch on the chief sources of anti-Semitism today from a global and domestic perspective and reflect a little on the balance between protecting Jews and political speech, and protecting speech. At AJC, for over 15 years, we have identified three primary sources of anti-Semitism: anti-Semitism from the far right, anti-Semitism from the far left, and anti-Semitism that emanates from extremist ideologies propagated in the name of Islam. I'll go over each one briefly. Anti-Semitism from the right is something many of us recognize easily. Think Charles Lindbergh, Father Coughlin, Henry Ford. Jews are powerful, Jews are clannish, Jews are not loyal Americans. In less than a year in Pittsburgh and Poway, we have twice witnessed the deadly consequences of this type of ideology. In an increasingly divided political atmosphere, bigotry flourishes, and social media and the internet allow this information to spread rapidly. Cloaked in the anonymity that the internet provides, people who once did not dare to share their abhorrent views in polite society have formed far-flung communities targeting Jews and other minorities for bigoted derision and egging on the violent and disturbed. Many white supremacists in the United States see Jews as their primary enemy, while other minorities are secondary targets. In this white supremacist worldview, African Americans and other minorities are the tools used by the so-called Jewish puppeteers to demean, denigrate, and defile the white race. Indeed, Arthur Gibson, a professor of sociology at the University of Dayton, has said that anti-Semitism has been the most enduring component of the white supremacist worldview from its creation. It must be said that the murderous anti-Semitic attacks in America in the last 9 months were rooted and nurtured in this sector. Anti-Semitism from the left also plays on the notion of Jewish power and dual loyalty. Again, Jews are seen as the paradigmatic community embodying the advantaged and despised elite. To be clear, Israel, like any nation, despised elite, it must be often comes masked as criticism of the state of Israel. To be clear, Israel, like any nation, does not deserve any special protection from criticism for the policy decisions that its government makes. One need only read the Israeli press or watch its extremely robust political process as the country goes through elections for the second time in 6 months in order to see such criticism. Yet, when friends of Israel in this country have their loyalty as Americans questioned, when impossible standards are applied to Israel that are not applied to any other country, or when cartoons that would not have looked out of place in Der Stürmer imputing sinister power to the Israeli Prime Minister appear in the New York Times, then something more nefarious than simple criticism has taken place. We see this in many aspects of the BDS movement, which I know we will discuss later today. While I recognize that some supporters of BDS believe themselves to be simply advocates for the Palestinian cause, at the heart of the movement is the notion that there should be no Jewish state. Increasingly, enemies of Israel employ Nazi analogies to describe Israel's behavior toward the Palestinians as they search for the most hateful way to attack the world's only Jewish state. With democratic Israel thus branded as fascist, it becomes only natural for many on the left to ignore the rights of Israeli and pro-Israel speakers to speak up for that country. And these radical activists seek to exercise the heckler's veto on college campuses. In the most extreme cases, we have seen troubling echoes of Europe, as some Jewish students have chosen not to associate with Israel for fear of ostracism or even their own personal safety. Finally, one cannot have a serious and honest conversation about anti-Semitism without talking about anti-Semitism propagated in the name of Islam. That is, in the name of a violent extremist interpretation of that sister Abrahamic faith. Since 2000, every murder of a Jew for being Jewish on the European continent was committed by an Islamist extremist. I spend a good deal of my time in Muslim-majority countries, have friends and family who are adherents to that faith, and I have no doubt that the overwhelming majority of Muslims want nothing but to live in peace and harmony with their fellow citizens. Let me repeat, I have no doubt that the overwhelming majority of Muslims want nothing but to live in peace and harmony with their fellow citizens. Yet, the lesson from Europe over the last 20 years is that we must be absolutely clear-eyed about the danger posed by radical Islamist ideology. With the sources of anti-Semitism now outlined, let me briefly draw out 3 principles that I think should play a role in our discussion as we seek to balance fighting anti-Semitism and protecting free speech. First, there is no community that has benefited more from the values and freedoms provided by the First Amendment than the Jewish community. Indeed, it is the First Amendment that has allowed the Jewish people and other minorities to flourish in this nation as full participants in the American experiment. With our rights thus guaranteed, we were no longer merely tolerated by benevolent rulers. Instead, we had the enshrined right to freely exercise our religion, speak out against injustice, and avoid having religion established upon us. This does not mean that every assertion of free speech protection is correct, and these topics can and should be debated carefully. Yet the discussion cannot and should not be framed as choosing between protecting Jews or the First Amendment. For one, it ironically feeds into the anti-Semitic notion of Jews controlling speech. Far more importantly, the very act of protecting the First Amendment is an act for the protection of minority rights. Next, the best answer to bad speech remains good speech. What we say matters often more than how we legislate. In order to capably combat anti-Semitism, those who would seek to call out their political opponents for hating Jews must be similarly willing to criticize their allies on their own side of the aisle. Leaders need to lead and conclusively demonstrate that anti-Semitism within their own ranks is unacceptable. That is why groups like the Bipartisan Congressional Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism are so important as unifiers and bridge builders. That is why the newly formed Congressional Black Jewish Caucus is vital to address issues between these two communities. We here can and should discuss anti-BDS laws, educational standards, the working definition of anti-Semitism. Laws and standards are important. Yet, in the end, this is a battle for ideas and a reassertion of common values. In a very real way, we are fighting for the soul of our nation. Finally, we must recognize that other nations have different conceptions of speech and take that into account in this global struggle. As Quentin Lopineau, a French diplomat who was a visiting fellow in the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, recently wrote in The Hill, and I quote, "We must each acknowledge that conceptions about freedom of expression differ among democracies. Every country in the world admits that some limitations to free speech may be necessary to protect other freedoms and human dignity. For historical and cultural reasons, European democracies have always conceived this balance a bit differently than the United States. For instance, the public promotion of Nazism, racism, and anti-Semitism are considered illegal in most, if not all, European countries." End quote. It is no longer sufficient to simply say that America is different from Europe. In the global struggle against anti-Semitism and hate, we need to spend more time talking with other nations about finding common ground to our approaches. These conversations will not be easy, but the defense of democracy demands no less. I do not suggest that we change our own conceptions or trample on the First Amendment. Indeed, AJC and I would argue against many European ideas. Yet a global struggle requires a global strategy, and these conceptions cannot be ignored. Thank you once again for this very special invitation. I look forward to participating in the panel. My most sincere thanks again to the Justice Department for convening this important program.
I want to thank the Attorney General and the Justice Department for putting together this day-long conference on anti-Semitism. And in my comments, I'm going to speak to what has been one of the largest and I think most successful policy initiatives, legal initiatives, to combat on certain manifestations of anti-Semitism. Manifestations that are not like the ones we just saw in the memory video, truly scary calls for death, but rather manifestations that are in some ways more difficult to deal with because they come cloaked in the mantle of human rights discussions. So in the past 4 years, 27 American states have adopted so-called anti-BDS laws. Now, what these laws say is that the laws do not ban boycotts of Israel. They do not prohibit anyone from boycotting Israel. What they do say is that boycotts of Israel are a form of bigotry and discrimination. The 27 states have classified such action discriminatory, bigoted, and thus the state will not do certain kinds of business with companies that choose to boycott companies or people simply because of their affiliation with Israel, simply because they have a connection with the State of Israel. Now, this has been an extraordinary wave of legislation, I would say almost a groundswell. There's been a deep, and it shows a deep recognition by American policymakers of this close connection between bigotry, anti-Semitism, and boycotts of companies and individuals based not on what they personally have done, but based on their affiliation, connection, presence in Israel. Starting with South Carolina and Illinois in 2015, this has really swept the nation in an extraordinary wave. One thing that needs to be pointed out about these laws, at a moment when so many things, including matters related to Israel, but also pretty much everything else, are seen as polarizing, divisive, drive Republicans and Democrats apart. That's not just Israel, that's everything here in this city. These anti-boycott laws have been extraordinarily bipartisan and produced an extraordinary policy consensus. In all 27 states that have enacted this, the measures have been overwhelmingly bipartisan, and indeed they've passed by overwhelming majorities and sometimes often near unanimity. So Republicans and Democrats in state houses across the country, in red states and blue states and purple states, have lined up and said, refusing to do business with someone, a discriminatory refusal to deal with a company, with a person, with an entity, because of their connection to Israel, that is something that is discriminatory enough that we will not prohibit it necessarily, but we do not want our state taxpayer money going to subsidize that kind of activity. And so these laws, just to give you a few more details, they come in two forms. Some say that states will not do business with companies. They will not contract with companies that engage in this kind of discriminatory refusal to deal. Others provide that the state won't invest their pension funds in such companies, and some do both. The understanding here, and I think one of the most important things about these laws, other than their actual effect, is the message they send. Because too often, those who wish to discriminate on the basis of Israeli origin, on the basis of Israeli nationality, try to take for themselves the language of human rights. They say, we're not discriminating, we're boycotting, which is supposed to make some kind of difference. We're doing this because we don't like, because they're doing bad things. They're doing bad things. We disagree with their conduct. Now, recently, Germany, Canada, and courts in France and Spain have concluded that treating Israelis, people present in Israel, companies present in Israel, as a fixed class and refusing to do business with them, what's called boycott, is indeed anti-Semitic, is indeed a form of discrimination. We've had very recently strong expressions by the German and Canadian parliaments of this, and now 27 American states are saying the same thing. They're saying the same thing. What's crucial to stress is these laws do not in any way penalize companies for their views about Israel. It is not the views about Israel that these laws target, but economic conduct aimed at Israel. Let me give you a couple examples. If a company hangs a banner from its headquarters, down with Israeli apartheid, hangs a big Palestinian flag, they're entirely eligible for state contracts and state investments under all 27 of these laws. On the other hand, if a company, not because it has any opposition to Israel, but because it's bullied and intimidated by boycott activists, chooses to refuse to deal with Israel, even if they're singing Hatikva while they do it, they will indeed be subject to these laws. That is, for example, the case of Airbnb, which made it completely clear that its partial boycott of Israel was not based on opposition to Israeli policies, had no ideological basis whatsoever, but was based on years of bullying and intimidation by boycott activists. Indeed, one of the insights of these laws is that companies that boycott Israel typically do not do so out of ideological conviction. They do so because they've been exposed to various pressures. And this is an insight which I personally owe to Ian Anderson, who is the principal flautist and lead singer of the rock band Jethro Tull. He plays often in Israel, and in an interview he decried musicians who cancel their concerts because of boycott pressure. He said many bad words about them that we will not repeat in the Great Hall, but he also said that they are not rock and rollers. Why? Because how were they targeted? The boycott activists, they don't start with the phone book of rock musicians with ABBA and work up their way up to ZZ Top. They see who is already doing things in Israel, who's already playing concerts, and they target them. So the people who succumb to boycotts are those who have already performed, who have already done business in Israel, who are planning to do more. They don't have a problem with Israel, but the social costs are made so high that they give up on it. And so that's not rock and roll. The same with companies like Airbnb. Airbnb was targeted because it didn't have a problem doing business in Israel and in the West Bank. That's why they were doing it. And the goal of these campaigns is to make the costs greater than the benefits. But what this shows is decisions to boycott Israel are not necessarily ideological decisions. And that's a point that's going to be relevant in a second when we talk about the First Amendment concerns. Israel is the home to the plurality of the world's Jews. It is also the only country in the world with a Jewish majority. Actions taken against on the basis purely of Israeli affiliation or identity are a clear proxy for anti-Semitic actions. It's true also that there are Jews living elsewhere, but we do not find it to be a defense to discriminatory conduct to say, yes, I'm only discriminating against a minority group in this one place. In the rest of my business, I don't discriminate against them. Partial discrimination is indeed also discrimination. Now I want to say something about how these laws are modeled. These laws are not the only laws that say if you discriminate against a certain group, if you refuse to do business with people because of their membership in a group, because of some characteristic, the state will not do business with you. At around the same time these laws were being passed, 20-some states also passed, and the federal government, through an executive order promulgated by President Obama, passed measures saying that companies are free to not hire, to discriminate, to boycott people on the basis of their sexual orientation. But if you do so, you're not going to be doing business with the federal government. You're not eligible for federal government contracts. And indeed, state laws provide for similar restrictions for a wide variety of statuses: veteran status, marital status, and many other statuses. But most saliently today, there's dozens of state laws and executive orders that are structured exactly like the anti-boycott ones, like the anti-BDS laws. You cannot do business with these people, but we consider that bigoted, and as President Obama said, we don't want to subsidize this bigotry with federal taxpayer dollars. And here we get into what I find perhaps the most frightening level of anti-Semitism in this discussion. Some of the very same organizations that lobbied federal and state governments to adopt rules barring state contracting with groups that boycott gays are now the exact same groups, the ACLU in particular, that have bringing lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the state anti-boycott laws. And the state anti-boycott laws now are the subject of significant litigation in at least five states. Two federal district courts have found that they unconstitutionally restrict speech. One has concluded the opposite. There is no speech issue here. Deciding who you do and do not do business with is not a form of speech. There is no speech being regulated. Indeed, if refusals to deal were a form of speech, all anti-discrimination law would be called into question. In attacking these laws, the ACLU says, oh, this is different. Here, it's a politically motivated refusal to deal. People are boycotting Israeli companies for a reason. And there's two things to say about that. First of all, it's not true, and secondly, it's not a distinction. As we said, most of the companies pressured to boycott Israel, those who these laws certainly contemplate, have no explicit or implicit political agenda whatsoever, and they say so. So it's not true that boycotting Israel is inherently political. It could be done to win favor in the Arab world, as the CEO of Orange Telecom, the big French telephone company, said at a hot mic at the Cairo Chamber of Commerce, we're boycotting Israel, can you please give us some business now? Or because of pressure from NGOs, as in the case of Airbnb. But more importantly, it's not a distinction, because we know it is not a defense to being made ineligible for federal or state contracts because one boycotts people on the basis of sexual orientation, to say, oh, I have an ideological problem with that sexual orientation. I find what they do problematic. I find their political positions problematic. I think they have harmful effects. That doesn't help at all. That does not in any way preclude the application of those state laws. Indeed, all of these boycotts are sometimes ideological and sometimes not. The Supreme Court has clearly held in Rumsfeld versus Fair that simply choosing not to do business with people is not speech. Why? Because there are many reasons you could not do business with them, including you're just not interested in their business, and many other factors. If you need to have a special explanation of why you're not doing business, as we see in many of these cases that the ACLU has brought. In one of these cases, for example, the plaintiff is not buying a Hewlett-Packard printer. Even a very informed observer would not know that that decision could conceivably have anything to do with Israel. But he says they have some business with Israel, so he's not buying a Hewlett-Packard printer. The action tells you nothing, the non-purchase of a Hewlett-Packard printer. It is only the explanation, because Hewlett-Packard printer does business with Israel and I have political disagreements with Israel. That's the protected speech. The explanation is protected, the action is not. And the ACLU lawsuits against these measures threaten to undermine all of anti-discrimination law, all of foreign sanctions law. Because of course, if choosing to not do business with a country or companies based in the country is a natural way of expressing opinion about that country, isn't doing business with companies based in the country also a natural way of expressing approval of that country? So all someone would have to do now is say, I'm not doing business with Iran because I want to make money in the oil sector. I support the Iranian Revolution. Such an idea has never been suggested. It goes against everything we know. And I think what's most dangerous now is that the anti-BDS laws have provided valuable protection and a valuable message that boycotting based on Israel connection is anti-Semitic, is discriminatory. But now there is a conscious effort by major organizations to actually do something even scarier, to create a second-class tier of discrimination. That all discrimination can be protected from by the denial of state contracts, except when it's discrimination based on connections to the Jewish state. There's a First Amendment right to do so. And that would create the most dangerous double standard to Jews of all. Thank you.
This has been a great discussion. So we have a few more minutes to sort of get into the discussion, and I want to pick up on what you just said, and I want to ask you, Chris, first. Do you believe that boycotting a state is First Amendment protected political speech?
Well, I'm hesitant to weigh in on that. It's a bit outside my lane, but I think it could raise difficult issues. You could see some context in where a decision to take some kind of action would be a reflection of belief in for the government to then prohibit you from engaging in a particular conduct where it's a reflective of a belief, there could be an issue. But on the other hand, states, the federal government generally has very broad contracting authority. There's a line of cases that affirm that. And so there are, Gene makes a strong case for his position, but I do think it raises some significant and interesting issues, and I would need to look at it a lot more carefully before offering much more than that.
Okay, and I want to ask you now, Eugene, to respond to something from an ACLU, former ACLU attorney named Amanda Shanor, who wrote this on Jack Balkin's blog. And I just want you to respond to this one point. Ordinary public accommodations laws regulate routine economic behavior, the buying and selling of goods and services, which does not generally trigger First Amendment coverages. Anti-BDS statutes, by contrast, specifically aim to silence a key form of expression, political boycotts, because of its message. Their aim is to quell dissent. Now, I know you've addressed sort of broader point, but I want to nail down on this idea that isn't there a difference between boycotting an individual, an American citizen, for their sexual preference, their gender, their race, their religion, and boycotting a country, which happens all the time? I mean, certainly, I'm sure we wouldn't, I think there ought to be more boycotts of Iran or China. You can go through the list.
So first of all, there's a question whether there should or shouldn't be, and then there's another question: could the government regulate it if it disagrees?
So is boycott?
So I want to say something very important about these laws. These laws are not about boycotts of the state of Israel. These are boycotts of, as the laws themselves say, persons or companies doing business in the state of Israel and territories under its control. So it's boycotts, yes, of persons because of their characteristics. Under these laws, people are not going to be disbarred from state contracts because they don't want to enter into a defense contract with the state of Israel. That's understood. So it's not the state of Israel that's on the protected end of these laws. It is, for example, take the Airbnb example, because this was one of the more open and publicly discussed issues. Who was on the other end of the Airbnb boycott? People who own small rental units. Some 200 owners of small accommodations that were listing them on Airbnb. How is that different from boycotting people on the basis of their sexual orientation?
So, just so I understand, primary boycotts of Israel would be fine in your view in this regard. It's the secondary boycotts of individuals doing business in Israel that is the problem.
Well, it depends how you define primary and secondary. That is to say, in the BDS movement, the primary target is people because of their connection to Israel. That is exactly who's being targeted. So they're going, unlike the Arab League boycott, which had a first-level boycott on the state of Israel, and then sought to also boycott companies doing business with the companies that did business with the state of Israel. Here, the first-order target are companies that happen to be operating or doing business in or have an Israeli national character. That's who they're going after.
Right, but I guess, well, let me ask you then. Do you believe that boycott is political speech and should be protected by the First Amendment?
So boycott is just another word for refusing to do business. And the Supreme Court already told us the answer to that in Rumsfeld versus Fair. In Rumsfeld versus Fair, an association of law schools had what they called a boycott of military recruiters. Why were they boycotting them? For an inherently expressive reason. They disagreed with the military's policies. And they said, we are boycotting military recruiters. The Supreme Court said, your position on the military's recruitment of homosexuals, that is free speech, whatever you say about that. But you're simply not inviting them to your job fair. That is not inherently expressive. And why is it not inherently expressive? Because it doesn't tell us anything. That's why you had to explain why you're doing it. Right? You have 200 employers come to a job fair. Not all the employers. Why are some employers not there? Because you chose not to do business with them. So you have to make a special point to say, we're doing the military, we're not including them because we disagree with them. But the actual conduct is itself tells you nothing. And that's the case of any kind of discriminatory conduct. A refusal to deal is not expressive. And the Supreme Court said so in Rumsfeld versus Fair.
Jason, what do you think about this question of boycotting and political speech?
I'm sitting next to one of the country's greatest experts on this
issue.
He
is one of the
asking
great
me
experts.
to critique it. I have to endorse what Professor Kontrovich said. I think it is possible, certainly, to express your opposition to policies of any government, including Israel. But when you start engaging in the kind of behavior that the BDS movement does, you cross a certain line if you are imposing penalties on companies who engage in business with Israel. And I think the lines have been very clearly drawn by Professor Kontrovich.
Elan, what do you think?
Well, this is somewhat far afield from Memory's expertise, but I'll say, taking one small step aside from the boycott and sort of the negative reinforcement of relationships, there's a lot that the government can do to promote behavior and the type of speech that is more healthy. Things like engaging with civil society, engaging with those who speak out against hatred of specific people, specific countries, both in the region as well as here. And that's hopefully not too far step aside from what you asked, but more in line with what we see, what we promote, and what we believe that a government can more safely and certainly effectively do as well.
I want to just switch for a second. This is about the First Amendment, which is really a sort of check on what government can do. But then there's the concept of free speech, which is a value which is greater than that. And in a sort of I mean, this is the topic of this particular panel, so I wanted to just go down and with our last few minutes, is there a point at which you have to tolerate some kind of anti-Semitism because free speech is sort of too important at that point? Or where would you draw that line? And how would you address it? I mean, Dr. Konorovich, how would you address it?
So, for example, I would distinguish quite sharply between actual conduct, which isn't speech, refusing to deal, and speech no matter how unpleasant. So, for example, I think in the campus context, which we'll address later, one is required to, and one should be vastly tolerant to speeches and demonstrations which make Jewish students feel very uncomfortable, which make them very unhappy. That is, the activity carried out on campus is typically pure speech, because students don't have any money to boycott with. That kind of activity, while it may make people extremely unhappy, is something which, not just in the name of the First Amendment, but I think in terms of values of discourse and protecting ourselves from becoming overly vulnerable safe space inhabitants, that we need to toughen ourselves to against. But when it crosses the line into business refusal to deal, Jews should stand on no worse footing than anyone else.
Thank you, Eli. I was really taken by the remarks of Mr. Hardy about the responsibility of the social media platforms, especially to be much more assertive in imposing certain guidelines and what is and what is not acceptable. But I recognize that there are First Amendment constraints to going in that direction. I think we understand that it will be social pressure, it will be the actions of sister communities, of the general public, that will exert the kind of influence on the haters and against the haters that we have to rely on. But it's going to be a combination of the culture rising up against hate and the social media platforms being responsible, and frankly the leadership of our government knowing where the lines are, but encouraging that kind of assertive behavior by these platforms that will make a big difference. It will also be important to our friends around the world who, when we complain to governments in Europe especially about the levels of hate that are inciting actions against our community, they often throw this back at us and say, well, do something about the social media platforms that are based in your country. I'm glad to see that the United States is taking a serious stab at this very key problem.
Thanks. Some of the points that Eugene raised, they go to an issue that we've seen kind of more broadly, which is like, what is, when you have really divisive issues, whether it's foreign interference, election interference, anti-Semitism, boycotts of Israel, what is the proper role of the government? So the government can speak. The government can approach social media companies, can disclose information about things that are happening on social media to the public, can disclose information about election interference, those types of issues. So, but what we've seen is that there's a very difficult lines to draw to determine when the government can play a productive role versus when it might play a counterproductive role. Like when the government singles out incidents of, say, election interference that could be controversial, it's a significant issue for the government to consider, like, what is the blowback going to be? Is the government, by disclosing that, is it going to make it better or worse? Are you going to, and to even engage in that exercise, the government has to be in a position going into that to have the confidence of the public, to be operating under consistent frameworks and guidelines that are consistent with the First Amendment. And so I think this is just a theme that we're seeing across a range of issues, and I think it's also relevant to this context as well.
And with that, unfortunately, we are now out of time. Sorry about that, Elliot, for that one.
1 minute?
1 minute? Okay, shoot.
So there are many reasons why, sociological, historical, and others, why America has been the greatest safe haven for the Jews in world history. Perhaps chief among those is the First Amendment protection and the First Amendment culture, which flourishes here. However, when hatred comes from foreign government backing, when it's mixed with social media and current messaging, we believe there are many points of legal intervention and roles that that the US government can play within that. It's not about somebody on a street corner shouting something. It's not about someone with a mimeograph machine making a pamphlet and passing it out. These are, in many cases, foreign governments, foreign entities, mixed with modern communications based within the US. And we believe that government does have a role to play at many points within.
And with that, please thank our panel here. I think it was a great discussion.
Thank you again, Eli, and all of our panelists for an outstanding discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we will take a brief break and reconvene at 11 a.m. Staff persons are available in the back to escort you to the restroom or the coffee shop.